And good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here after last night. What a wonderful cross-cultural adventure it was for me personally. First time in a kilt, and I rather enjoyed it, actually. So, we will be talking today about yet another cross-cultural issue, and that is, how do we provide intercultural support? And I don't even refer to it as training anymore. I refer to it as intercultural support because it requires more than just training for the 21st century expat. In other words, what we're looking at is cross-cultural training that can no longer be your father's cross-cultural training. So let's take an exploration of what we need to be doing to develop cultural competencies for the 21st century organization and the 21st century expat. A post-global world, and I'll define what that means in a moment, of borderless workers linked through technology requires 21st century individuals and organizations to implicitly have cultural competence built into their DNA. There is no wiggle room anymore for any kind of cultural ignorance. Because in the 21st century, we are linked automatically with individuals and organizations that are working in cultures different from our own. Unfortunately, traditional cultural training simply did not provide this. So let's take a look at what happened, where we are, and where we need to go. In the pre-global world, we would meet individuals, perhaps from other cultures, and this is a little bit of an example of the meeting. It was face-to-face very often, it was one-on-one very often, and we would often be speaking with individuals in teams that presented unfamiliar scenarios to us. Today, of course, we're linked, and we're often working in teams virtually, and the ability to work in multicultural teams with individuals and organizations that are made up of many different cultures is precisely the primary skill that's necessary. Because expats, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, moving to Shanghai, they are no longer having to work with the Chinese environment only. They're no longer having to work with only the Shanghai environment. Ms. Jones, who is the assignee, is now responsible for a team, and that team is probably made up of individuals in Shanghai and in Dubai and in Paris and in New York. And they're probably reporting to headquarters with an organization that might be in Amsterdam. So the ability to manage multicultural teams, to communicate effectively through technology, is perhaps a greater skill than simply knowing about the cultural do's and don'ts of the particular host location that I am now assigned to. The assignments then, in previous years, well, we could go back pretty far, couldn't we? I mean, probably the first relocation was when Adam and Eve had to leave the garden, right? But we weren't around to support that one. But when we started doing intercultural training and providing mobility services for international assignees and people who were relocating, often the assignments looked like this. They were traditional 3-year assignments. They involved a trailing spouse who was most often female. Usually the motivation for the international assignment was to get them out of here for some reason. And the motivation, once the assignment was completed, was to bring them back alive. Right? Now, today, we still have some of those traditional assignments, but also we have flexible versions of those assignments. So people aren't staying for 2 years, maybe they're staying for a year. Maybe they're staying for more than 3 years. Maybe they're localizing. We have rotators who are moving from one location to another periodically. We have frequent business travelers who are moving every 2 weeks or moving in and out. And we have commuters who are simply going to their location, coming back home, and going back out to that location again. So the traditional assignments no longer, in fact, are the majority of the international assignments, and we have to adjust how we train and develop people for the skills that are necessary, given the fact that the training, that the assignments themselves have changed, the nature of the assignments themselves have changed significantly. So it's not just only the traditional assignments, but it's traditional assignments plus these new versions, non-traditional assignments. Now, some of us might remember these folks. These were the traditional assignees, going back, probably quite a ways. Today, they probably look more like this. You know these folks, right? All right, and you probably also know some of these folks because the nature of the assignees have changed, haven't they? And we have to adapt the services that we provide to these new international assignees who have new needs and whose personal and professional requirements are very, very different from what they may have been in the past. You know, I think she's always been around, hasn't she? Right. So we have to create some cultural competencies for these new expats in these new assignments with new needs. And I like to think that we can link this to the issue of diversification, specialization, and personalization, because it requires all of these things to achieve these new goals. This is an era of post-globalization. Well, let me talk about what that means. We saw that these new assignees have some new personal issues and elements that need to be dealt with, but we also have the professional needs. These are folks now who are facing the requirement of having to develop multicultural skills. So what are the requirements to be a global manager in today's world? Well, global managers are a little bit different from domestic managers. They're a unique beast, and they face some unique challenges. They have to pursue personal and professional life and must balance goals and achievements within an alien environment for most cases, and within the realities of limits and failures. In other words, there's a higher risk of limits and failures with global managers because they are managing significantly different environments. They have to implement global strategies and function within powerful centripetal and centrifugal forces, global forces, that are pulling things apart and also moving things together. But they have to do so with local tactics, and they have to do so in order to succeed on the hard bottom line. Global managers have to answer to an increasingly irrelevant headquarters and far away, and must accept the importance of cultural differences while serving increasingly demanding local environment, and they're managing the cultural differences in order to manage what happens for success on the hard bottom line. So these are some paradoxes, and the reason they're having to struggle with these is because these new skills are necessary. Let's take a look at what some of these new skills are. The post-global managers have to have some basic language skills that domestic managers simply don't have to have. There needs to be English language proficiency because the language of business communications around the world is a form of global English. Yeah? The language of business is not English. The language of business, as all of us know, is the language of the customer. So if I'm in Brazil, I must speak Portuguese. If I'm in France, ultimately, I must speak French. If I'm in China, I must speak Mandarin. But the language of global communications is a form of global English. So we must master this skill of working with global English, and we also, of course, have to develop second and multi-language skills, because those who have them simply will succeed more quickly in their local environments. But perhaps even more important than the language skills are the cultural skills, the ability to function on multicultural teams, the ability to see oneself as a cultural being, and to know what that means, the impact that you have on others when you're in their environment. The ability to then apply behaviorally the cultural facts and knowledge that you accumulate or that you learn. It's not enough to simply provide people with information. We have to also then give people the opportunity to practice new behavioral skills in applying what they've learned about culture so that they can succeed more effectively, because it is all about the application, not merely the accumulation of knowledge. And I'd like to add that in a post-global world, we also have to develop a global mindset. Perhaps the greatest skill of all is not so much being able to accumulate cultural facts and knowledge, but rather to know how to apply it and how to see yourself in relation to others in the very big picture, because we're working with many different cultures all the time. An awareness of the post-global dynamics and their impact on my personal and professional behavior. Now, what are those post-global dynamics? Anybody here working with this unique culture? Singalandu? We've done lots of cultural trainings on Singalandu. Right? You know, Singapore, London, Dubai. Have you ever been to Salmonjo? Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Johannesburg, Moscow, Genexia. These are cultures in the post-global world that we have to develop the skills to manage and to be effective in. There are cultures that are uniquely aligned because of their similarities in stages of development, such as Salmomjo. There are cultures that are uniquely aligned because of their political or regional similarities, such as Moscow. And there are cultures that are aligned because of the generational similarities all around the world. We have Gen X's and we have Gen Y's. And there may be similarities between these cultures than there are similarities between the location where they are and where they developed. In other words, in the work environment, working in Singapore, London, and Dubai might be more similar than either of those cultures or any of those cultures are to the location in which they are placed. So we have to become familiar with how to manage this issue of working across generations, regional similarities, and developmental similarities. In the post-global world, we have the development of these unique global islands like Singapore, London, Dubai, where the behaviors are more similar to each other than they are to the country that they emerge from. We have the phenomenon and the challenge of having to work in multicultural teams with lots of cultures all the time. And we have the phenomenon of melting cultural icebergs. We're all familiar with the cultural iceberg because that was part of what we learned in traditional cultural training. But today we have melting cultural icebergs, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Here's the traditional iceberg. There we go. Culture is floating in the global seas. We have the tips of the iceberg as the visible culture. Those are the perceivable behaviors. But we all know that that's just 10% of the story. 90% of the story, the important aspect of culture, is the implicit culture, the invisible part of the iceberg, the values, traditions, norms of a culture. And these don't change very quickly. And these are created over, perhaps in some cases, centuries, through the confluence of history, religion, tradition, and climate. Okay, that's the traditional classic model of looking at culture. However, in today's world, we have the post-global world. All of the icebergs are being affected by forces of globalization. These forces of globalization, represented by the sun, are shining on all the icebergs. And these forces of globalization are technology, mass communications, transportation, the development of global world cultures. These global forces, when they shine on the icebergs, have a profound effect at the superficial level, at the tip. When the sun shines, the tips all begin to look the same. That's where it melts first. So everywhere around the world, with the exception of a few iconic symbols, at the tip of the iceberg, the visible part, the perceivable part, we're seeing things that look the same. You can step off the plane in London, and in New York, and in Rio de Janeiro, and in Shanghai. And with the exception of a few architectural icons, this all looks the same. And our work behaviors seem to be the same. But at a deeper level, beyond the tip of the iceberg, because that's where the similarities are, if we go down to the bottom of the iceberg, where the fundamental values are, then in those same countries, in those same cultures, that's where we see the values of those cultures. And that doesn't change quickly, and that doesn't melt easily. The global manager today is challenged to work in environments that appear superficially similar, but are fundamentally still very different. And where the cultural values, the hidden part, is often unseen and unknown until it's revealed. Now, it gets revealed in different ways, and one of the ways it gets revealed is in the workplace. So with cultural training, we're having to today do more than just provide people with the information about how to live and work in Shanghai. We have to provide people with information on how to work in a culture that may appear similar superficially in the workplace and in daily life, but in fact may still remain fundamentally very different. And this is what I meant when I said we have to help people understand and manage the global dynamic forces in a post-global world. So cultural training then, in the past, usually focused on a single culture. Let's get you up to speed on how to live and how to work in a particular single location. Its goal was to help people survive in often places that were very different from what they came from. These were focused on the traditional assignments, and those were 3 years, so these training programs often were designed to give people the skills they needed for long-term adjustment. But long-term adjustment for short-term assignees and for non-traditional assignments is not necessarily the focus. They were assignee-focused, they were not organizational-focused. In other words, if we got the family prepared, that's all we needed to do. In today's world, we have to prepare the organization as well. And they were transactional. In other words, cultural training was per family, each time, get them in, get them out. And it was often a one-time event. But we know that good training, and it was often culture-specific, but good training today needs to be multicultural, because that individual, that assignee who's in Shanghai, is working on multicultural teams. They're working with the responsibility of having to deal with 17 other Pacific Rim nations, plus headquarters in other parts of the world. So we have to provide the multicultural information on how to survive in Shanghai, but also how to work in a multicultural world. We cannot afford to have people merely surviving. We have to have people thriving. Competition requires it. So if the goal is to simply move people and get them to survive and bring them back alive, that is no longer possible. We have to get people to a level of thriving, to be completely successful in their work. No organization can survive at levels less than excellence in today's competitive world. We're dealing with non-traditional assignments, so they can be short-term, they can be all of the ones that we mentioned before, and therefore the goals of intercultural training need to be different. And organization focus. We've got to develop the intercultural skills of the entire organization, the receiving office as well as headquarters, so that everyone knows how to behave with each other more effectively. It has to be strategic and talent-focused. It cannot be transactional, because not only are we giving people the skills to thrive in their new environment, but we are strategically building the talent of the 21st century organization. Everyone here who's involved in HR internationally is on the vanguard of globalizing their organization, because it is their responsibility. It is our responsibility to develop the global talent so that the organization can survive and thrive in the 21st century. And cross-cultural training needs to be a continuous development process, not a single one-time event. So people need to be trained, but they also need to be supported. They also need to be refreshed. They also need to be helped through the inevitable bumps that will come even after the training. Fortunately, we have means for managing these things. For developing the global mindset, that's probably more important than just monocultural information, and technology can help. So some folks say that the world is getting smaller and the world is getting simpler, and that we're really understanding each other more than we ever have before and learning from each other more than we ever have before. And I think that's a nice idea, but I don't think it's really happening. I think history shows us that when cultures come together, one of the first responses, when there is cultural interaction, and there certainly is now in the 21st century, one of the first reactions is mystification, conflict, misunderstanding, not kumbaya and peace and love and brotherhood. That comes when people understand, when people are trained, when people learn how to behave more effectively with the cultural differences that they're interacting with. And therefore, the training is essential. The support is essential in the 21st century more than it ever has been, because the world, although is getting smaller on the one hand, without the understanding that is necessary to manage cultural interaction, we have the possibility of greater misunderstanding and greater conflict and all of the problems that come along with it. So we have to then, in this smaller world, actually prepare people more effectively than we ever have before. How do we do it? How do we get there? Well, here's some thoughts. And I think best practices are showing this in different organizations. We in our organization try to implement a lot of these ideas as well. that we put global mindset skills front and center, as opposed to simply the providing of culture-specific information. Giving people the opportunity to behave in ways that are different, to practice new behaviors that are culturally more appropriate for whatever different culture they might be working in, to develop the communication skills that are necessary to be effective in a multicultural environment. We do give people access to culture-specific information because if you're working on multicultural teams, you need more cultural information, not less. But that doesn't need to be trained. There's access for it. You can do it through technology, and therefore you can blend technology with training and coaching support. There has to be an initial event, but there has to be follow-up coaching, support, continuous learning opportunities. We put our graduates of intercultural training programs into learning blog communities where they can continue to learn best practices from each other even after the training event. This provides the support that's necessary and the ongoing support that's critical. There needs to be constant and intense customization of all programs because we saw that the traditional expats are no longer, and every family has special needs, and those special needs need to be dealt with right up front. And finally, we need to be focusing cultural training not only on the expat and the family, but on the organization that's sponsoring them. To give the organization the skills, headquarters, as well as receiving offices, to give them the skills to manage across cultures. Without this kind of a focus and without this kind of a strategy, I think we're providing skills from an older time that's no longer with us. And moving into the 21st century requires us to try to apply some new focus with new goals to treat new needs. And after all, is this going to be easy? Is this going to be hard? Well, no pain, no gain, right? Not necessarily easy, no. In fact, probably working across cultures is one of the hardest things that we face in an intercultural world, in an interculturally connected world. Not easy, but with practice, we can do it. I'll leave you all with an intercultural exercise right now. If you have it, please take out a pen. If you have a pen or a pencil. And on a blank piece of paper, I'll ask you to write something down. But before you write it down, put your pen or your pencil in your other hand. All right? Now, with your pen or pencil in your other hand, I'd like you to write down a word or a phrase that describes what it feels like writing with the wrong hand. As you write with the wrong hand, write down a word or a phrase that describes what it feels like to do so. Now, what were the words that you wrote down? Just shout them out. Awkward. Uncomfortable. Strange. Painful. Yes? Loss of self-confidence. Clumsy. Challenging. Ugly. These words, difficult, challenging, awkward, these words are the same words that are used to describe what it feels like to live and work in another culture. Transferees and individuals who are having to work in multicultural teams find these experiences similar. But all I asked you to do was to do something that you normally don't even think about doing, just in a slightly different way. Because you're doing the same thing, but just slightly differently. But in that slight difference was the whole world and all of these feelings. This is not easy work, but it is essential work in the 21st century. And did you notice when you wrote down your words that with practice, you would get better at it? And that's why we need continuous learning and continuous coaching and support. And once you do get better at it, once you practice it, you wind up with 2 skills, not 1. You're able to write with both hands. And you come away from the experience with new skills, new knowledge, and new ways to handle old problems. to advance your own individual success and the success of your organization in the 21st century. Thank you all very much.